everybody, it's Helen Hillix, your host for From My Heart to Yours. And I'm really excited today to talk about what is going on under the surface in your relationship. And I want to give you some real live examples of real clients that I've worked with over the years so that you can relate to real live things instead of just concepts. I want to tell you real stories and how they relate. And I believe that you're going to find something in some of them that you can use for yourself and for your romantic relationship, whether you're married or just partners or whatever. You know, you want to have the best sex you possibly can, and yet there is so much that can get in the way of it. So I'm going to start with a couple. I'm going to call them Susie and Mark. And they've been married like 38 years or something like that. Very successful in business. And the issue between them, the complaints that they have, he complains that she spends too much time working on their businesses and their investments. And she complains that when she doesn't feel like having sex, he turns to pornography. And so without getting judgmental, we got to dive into those two issues, those two complaints about one another and take a look at what was really going on. And the thing that we got to was that neither one of them wanted to be vulnerable to the other one. Let's start with Susie. She had lots of insecurities, a lot of body image issues. She was raised in an era when women are supposed to look a certain way, act a certain way, sound a certain way. Everything was prescribed. And if you didn't look exactly like that, she judged herself and she felt very insecure with her husband. But she was very smart and very good at business. And she could avoid all those feelings of vulnerability that she had around whether she was attractive or appealing to her husband by busying herself with work all the time. And so she never had to be vulnerable to whether or not he really was attracted to her. And that was her way of not being vulnerable. And then she could sit over there and judge him for turning to pornography. And that also made her feel less vulnerable because she was so judgmental of it, even though she was constantly comparing herself in her mind to the images that Mark was looking at on pornography. So what's Mark's side of it? Well, he hates being so vulnerable to his wife, whether she's in the mood or she's not in the mood. How can he get her in the mood? You know, how much whining and dining and seducing does he have to do in order to get her in the mood? All of which made him feel very much like less of a man. And I know some of you guys can really relate to this. It's like men resent the fact that it's harder for women to get aroused than it is for men. There's a lot of resentment there that women aren't just instantly ready and that men have to spend time getting them ready. Now, this isn't always the case. Sometimes it's the opposite, that the woman is always ready and the guy doesn't want to. But in this case, it was he who felt vulnerable every time he had to initiate with his wife, fearing that she would not want to connect to him sexually. And so rather than just have to wait for her and connect to her and process with her, he would turn to pornography. And that way he felt like, I don't have to wait for her. I'm not vulnerable to her. I can take care of myself. And I think that is such a perfect example of a couple that doesn't want to get vulnerable with one another. So they develop these opposing ways. And sometimes they're not opposing, but in this case, you know, she turned to business, he turned to pornography and masturbation. And that way, neither one of them felt that vulnerable to the other one. You know, she was very successful in business and that would, you know, puff her up and make her feel valuable. And he could turn to pornography anytime and feel that feeling of being wanted. So, what happened though, guys? What happened? This is the issue, isn't it? That what happened, of course, is that it was interfering in their ability to connect to one another sexually, because she was always turned off by the idea that he was using pornography, and he was always felt rejected because she was spending so much time on business. And so it was interfering in their ability to have sacred sexuality, which they both wanted. They loved each other dearly, and they were connected as a family and wanted to stay that way. So this is an example that you can compare yourself to, not in a negative way, but just compare yourself to see if you do any of those things. If you're covering up your vulnerability of wanting your wife or your girlfriend or whatever by using pornography so that you don't feel so dependent on her for sex. And if you're a woman, if you are punishing him for looking at pornography by withholding yourself and making yourself too busy with the kids or too busy with work or your friends or whatever it is. And I forgot to mention that about Susie and Mark, but she was punishing him by withholding because she felt so insecure and vulnerable. And so rather than talking about how insecure and vulnerable she was kind of punishing him by busying herself with other things. Okay, so that's couple number one. Couple number two is Janet and Robert. And they are a couple that's been together for, 7 years, let's say. And they were having the issue of difficulty with penetration. She was postmenopausal, and they loved each other very much, very happy to be together. And he loved to have intercourse. That was his favorite way of being sexual. And she loved all different kinds of ways, but she was having difficulty opening. And her vagina was painful when he tried to penetrate her. And often they could not have intercourse and had kind of given up on it and were not happy about it. And the more we talked, the issue of money came up. And we discovered, or I discovered, I guess they already knew this, that they had never talked about their financial arrangement in all these years that they had been together. They were not married, but they lived together. And they intended to be together forever. But they had never talked about their financial arrangements and, why they weren't getting married and why they hadn't discussed what their arrangement should be. He had a lot more money than she had. Was he expecting her to work and contribute 50-50? There were all kinds of dynamics going on. She expected him to support her to whatever degree he could and whatever degree she needed. And he expected her not to be using him for money, but to pull her weight financially, so to speak. He had grown children that were expecting to inherit all of his money or all of his property or whatever. But it's like the more we dived into this, the more painful it felt. And the more insecure I could see that the woman was, and the more insecure I could see that the man was, because he had been used for money before. And so here again is that fear of being vulnerable to one another. And the way it was being acted out in this relationship, and this was not conscious, guys. I think that even with Mark and Susie, that was not conscious what they were doing. Only by digging and exploring did we come up with what was really going on. But he didn't say, oh, I'm not going to be vulnerable to you, I'm going to turn to pornography. It was not a conscious decision like that. It's just what they did as a coping mechanism. And here too with Janet and Robert, this was not a conscious decision that they made. But what had ended up happening was he was not opening himself completely to her. He was not really discussing his financial situation and what his expectations were and how he felt protective of himself. And so he was literally not opening himself to her. And this we only discovered after spending quite a bit of time on the fact that she was not literally opening to him, that her vagina would not open to him. So that was mind-blowing to me, was that how our bodies act out whatever we're feeling. And for her, she did not feel safe enough to open herself to him. Now, there were obviously hormonal issues and so forth, but those weren't being dealt with because she didn't really want to open completely to him, because she didn't feel he was open completely to her. So this is just another example of how afraid we are of being vulnerable, how afraid we are of really opening our full selves to one another, and how afraid we are of discussing the most obvious things like money. So this is another thing that I want you to challenge yourselves to look at and to see if you relate to. What in your relationship is making you not feel safe? Is it that your wife doesn't clean the house, and so you feel like your needs are never important to her because you like the house to be cleaned? Or is it that your husband spends money on, trailers and boats and so forth, and isn't saving money for the kids to go to college or whatever you think is important, or not buying a bigger house, or maybe not buying a house at all because you're spending the down payment on toys? So there are all these possibilities, guys, of things that are not so obviously related to sex, but they are related to sex because they're related to life, and they're related to your feelings or lack of feelings of being safe. Because good sex, sacred sex, where you are connected body, mind, and spirit, that comes from feeling safe and relaxed with one another. And if there are these obvious issues like money that have not been managed, that have not been agreed on, that have not been resolved, then that is going to get in the way of your sex life. And then there's Ellen and Tim, and they are a younger couple that have been together for quite a while, nonetheless, both successful in business. It was his business, though, before they got together. And they were having difficulty with certain types of sex that she didn't want to do, and he wanted sex way more often than she did. And what we uncovered in that situation is that they both had a lot of trauma in their childhoods. And it was very difficult for her to feel out of control because she had made mistakes and been promiscuous and got pregnant with a married man, and all these things that made her feel bad about herself and made her feel shut down and ashamed of herself and her sexuality. And she didn't want to be seen as a sex object by her husband, but she thought she was because he wanted her often. And he grew up in a traumatic childhood with a mother who was a drug addict. And so one of the ways that he really was desperate to connect was on that deep, intimate level, to fill that void of a mother's love wanting him over and over and over that he did not have. So after we uncovered all of that, and she could see that he really didn't see her as a sex object, he saw her as his loving wife, then she could begin to relax and enjoy, and she forgave herself for her early missteps, and eventually was able to really own her own sexuality. And it turned out that she wanted sex just as much as he did. And of course, the irony is, once he felt how much she really loved him and wanted him, then he could relax and he didn't care about having sex quite so often. So that's another thing that I want you really to take a look at in your relationship is, are there situations in your relationship where it looks like you're mismatched? And are you really? Or is it something from your childhood or from another relationship that you're holding on to as you think it's protecting you, but it isn't? But you're holding on to it, and that is blocking you from the true expression of your own sexual desire and your own ability to relax and be in that oneness energy together sexually. So that's another thing for you to look at, is how has your past and what you learned in your past affected you today. And then there is the couple of Judy and James. And they also had been married quite a while, and they had been in a particular dynamic where Judy was the primary breadwinner and would go off working, and James was the one that stayed home with the kids. And after the kids were grown, James realized he had always been suppressing himself and not really getting what he wanted from Judy. And so he just kind of cracked open. He compared it to like breaking a leg. It was like just popped out that he couldn't take it anymore. And so again, it seems like a really painful thing to go through, and it is a painful thing to go through when you've been together a long time and one party just says, I can't take it anymore, and you really don't even understand it. But it can be, guys, it can be a wonderful, wonderful opening for you to have a brand new kind of relationship and exploration. And it turns out that, he was molested as a little boy and felt like he couldn't tell anybody because he didn't want to break apart the family. And so take a look at that, how that replicates this situation. That happened later was he was in a situation where he was feeling used by being the one to stay home all the time and not get his needs met, but he couldn't tell anybody because he didn't want to break up the family. And she was raised by a mentally ill mother off and on, sometimes wasn't even there. And she felt this incredibly desperate need to have a stable family, which is what she thought she had. And then when he said, this is not working, it really threw her for a loop. And so that old way of being really interfered. And when they had the disruption, it really interfered. But then they began to rebuild and explore and change and evolve, and really did create, or in the process of really creating, a brand new relationship in which they are able to have passionate, sacred sexuality. So I want you to look at that too and see how that fits in your relationship, how you've gotten into these ruts that feel like, oh, this is just the way it is. This is okay. There's nothing wrong with this. But there may very well be something wrong with it, in that one or both of you may not be getting your needs met at all. But on the surface, things look okay. So take a look deeper, guys. Take a look deeper and see if you are just settling because it seems convenient and stable, or whether you really are experiencing that heart's desire connection with your partner. Because you can have it. You can have it. So I'm just taking a moment to kind of let the energy settle, because I know I've thrown a lot of examples at you very quickly, and they're very intense examples. And I want to bring up one more, in which, again, this couple had also been together for a long time, but they had a long period of separation within the same house with no sex at all and no real connection, until one of them filed for divorce, and that shook them up enough to say, let's get some help and see if there's any way to salvage this. And what came out in that situation is that each of them would interpret what was going on in the relationship according to one of the ways that their parents, for him, it was the dad. And the dad believed that he could never get his needs met as long as he was in love with a woman. And so he would find ways to sabotage it. And hers was a really crazy mother who would, connect and reject and connect and reject her. And so she had this voice that would interpret things that he was doing very personally. And he had this voice saying, I'm never going to get my needs met if I don't get out of here. or if I don't withdraw, if I don't take my own time. But really, there was no conflict in getting his needs met, or there was no need to interpret what he was doing as a rejection of her. But this is another thing to notice is, what does your mind tell you about your partner? What does your mind tell you about them, and how does it relate to things that you learned in your childhood about relationships? And I'll bet you, if you're really willing to see it, you'll find one parent or the other that is the primary voice in your head telling you negative things about what's happening in your relationship. I know for me, it's my mother. You know, my mother, basically, my dad left when we were young, and my mother basically taught us that men are not to be trusted. And there was a female mafia kind of energy that went back generations. My grandmother lived on a farm that she owned, and she farmed herself, even though she was married. They lived together, but they each farmed their own farms. And so I grew up with this idea that you're not supposed to need a man. And of course, you can imagine how well that did in my own relationships. Not well. You know, I'm still breaking free of that ridiculous belief, but it's my mother's voice in my head. And I know you have it too. Somebody's voice is in your head. So I gave you all these examples tonight because I want you to see how it actually plays out in real life. And it can be all kinds of things from, you know, childhood trauma, which is very, very prevalent. Let me just be clear about that. Very, very prevalent. Childhood trauma creates a tremendous number of blocks to sacred sexuality. But without diving deep and seeing it where, you know, like with my first couple, Susie and Mark, you know, where they didn't want to be vulnerable with each other, or all the other couples, some of it's not childhood trauma, some of it's just adaptations that we've learned over the years. But if you don't look below the surface and you just keep fighting about, I want blowjobs, I don't want to give them. I want sex, I don't want sex. You know, I want to have sex in the morning. No, I like to have sex at night. If you just stay on that level, you know, you need to take hormones because we can't have intercourse. I don't want to take hormones. You know, if you deal with it, if you stay on that surface level, you're not going to resolve the issues. Even if you think you have resolved it by having sex every other night or on some kind of schedule, or blowjobs once a week or whatever it is, even if you think you've resolved it, you haven't, because you wouldn't have had the issue in the first place if there weren't something deeper going on. So just take my word for it and look, take a look and see if you can find the something deeper. And if you can't, then get some help with someone like me or somebody else, and do the process, do the work, and you will be so glad you did, because you will have a kind of connection and a peacefulness in your relationship that'll be the foundation of not only great sacred sex, but the foundation of a great life, because you have that feeling that somebody's got your back and that you're connected and nothing can shake that. So go forth and prosper, guys. You know, this is coming out on, I don't know, the second week of December. And I want you to use this as part of my year-end series on how to clean things up so you can have a brand new beginning in 2020. So I love you all, and I will talk to you next week.